Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be part 3 of the lecture series that is talking about the establishment of the United States government and the development of American politics. It's been a little break since the last time we had talked about this topic specifically, but I will remind you of our essential question for it. That is, how did the establishment of the United States government both symbolize continuity and a change in political thought throughout the region? And you have, as always, these kind of sub questions in regards to change, continuity, causation, consequence, significance, and perspective that are designed to get you guys to kind of think about that topic at hand, and trying to ultimately get you guys to an understanding of that essential question. The topic at hand for us today is going to be primarily John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's presidencies. But before we can get there, we have to talk about Washington and how his presidency ends, and specifically his farewell address. So in his farewell address, he was assisted by Alexander Hamilton, and the retiring president wrote a farewell address for a publication in the newspapers in late 1796. In this message, he had spoke of enormous influence because of Washington's prestige that he had gained throughout his tenure as president. He spoke about the policies and practices that he considered to be unwise, and he warned Americans a few things. 1, not to get involved in European affairs. 2, not to make permanent alliances in foreign affairs. 3, not to form political parties. And 4, not to fall into what is called sectionalism. And for the next century, future presidents would heed as gospel Washington's warning against permanent alliances. However, in the case of political parties, Washington was already kind of behind in the times, since political parties were well on their way to becoming a vital part of the American political system, and as we know, are staunchly ingrained into our political system here in the United States. But one long-range consequence of Washington's decision to leave office after 2 terms was that later presidents followed in this example. Presidents basically elected to 2 terms, including Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson, would voluntarily retire even though the Constitution placed no limit on a president's tenure in office. The 2-term tradition would then continue to be unbroken until 1940, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt won election to a 3rd term. Then the 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, made the 2-term limit a part of the Constitution. So where we're at is we have a changing in power for the first time in this young country's history, and we're going to see how that kind of shifts, whether it's going to be peaceful, whether it's going to be not peaceful, and what the importance of a peaceful transition of power is. So with the election of 1796, comes John Adams' presidency. And even as Washington was writing his farewell address, political parties were working to gain majorities in the 2 houses of Congress and to line up electors from the various states to elect the next president. The vice president, John Adams, was the Federalist candidate, while the former Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, was the choice of the Democratic Republicans. Eventually, what we will see is that Adams won by 3 electoral votes, and Jefferson would become the vice president, since the original Constitution gave that office to the candidate receiving the 2nd highest number of electoral votes. Since the ratification of the 12th Amendment in 1804, the president and vice president have run as a team, but that was not the case then. So Adams wins the election. Adams becomes the 2nd president of the United States, and his interesting relationship that he has with Thomas Jefferson would grow to be more interesting as the next 4 years would ensue under the Adams presidency. But another thing that came out of the Adams presidency is something called the XYZ Affair. And basically troubles abroad related to the French Revolution shortly before Adams' presidency presented him with his first major challenge of his presidency, in that Americans were angered by reports that the United States merchant ships were being sieged by French warships and privateers. And in seeking a peaceful settlement, Adams sent a delegation to Paris to negotiate with the French government. Certain French ministers, known only as X, Y, and Z, kind of like code names, requested bribes as the basis for entering into negotiations. The American delegates indignantly refused. Newspapers reports on these demands made by X, Y, and Z infuriated many Americans, who now clamored for war against France. Millions for defense, but not only 1 cent for tribute became the slogan of the hour, and one faction of the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, hoped that by going to war in the United States could gain French and Spanish lands in North America. President Adams, on the other hand, resisted the popular sentiment for war, and recognizing that the United States Army and Navy were not yet strong enough to fight a major power, the president avoided war and sent new ministers to Paris. So this kind of leads us to what is called the Alien and Sedition Acts. In response to the anger against France, strengthened by the Federalists in the congressional elections of 1798, which was enough to win a majority in both houses, the Federalists took advantage of their victory by enacting laws to restrict their political opponents, the Democratic Republicans. For example, since most immigrants voted Democratic Republican, the Federalists passed what was called the Naturalization Act, which increased from 5 to 14 years required for immigrants to qualify for U.S. citizenship. And they also passed what was called the Alien Acts, which authorized the president to deport aliens considered dangerous and to detain enemy aliens in the time of war. Most seriously, they passed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal for newspaper editors to criticize either the president or Congress and impose fines or imprisonment for editors who violated the law. So what we're seeing is a expenditure of the executive branch's power, and a stark contradiction to a lot of the principles that have been outlined in the U.S. Constitution just a few short years ago. So what we're left with is now this kind of turmoil between these political parties that Washington had warned against, and it's only going to increase when we start talking about the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So Democratic Republicans argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts violated rights guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. In 1799, however, the Supreme Court had not yet established the principle of judicial review, which we will talk about in a second. Democratic Republican leaders, however, challenged the legislation of the Federalist Congress by enacting what was called nullifying laws, or nullification, of their own in the state legislature. The Kentucky legislature adopted a resolution that had been written by Thomas Jefferson, and the Virginia legislature adopted a resolution introduced by James Madison. Both resolutions declared that the states had entered into a compact in forming the national government, and therefore, if any act of the federal government broke that compact, the state could nullify or go against, or basically not listen to, the federal law. Although only Kentucky and Virginia adopted nullification or nullifying resolutions in 1799, they set forth an argument and a rationale that would be widely used in the nullification controversy of the 1830s leading up to the Civil War. The most immediate crisis over the Alien and Sedition Acts faded when the Federalists lost their majority in Congress after the election of 1800, and the new Democratic-Republican majority allowed the acts to expire or repealed them. And in addition, the Supreme Court under John Marshall, who we will also talk about here in a little bit, asserted its power in deciding whether a certain federal law was constitutional. Which brings us to the election of 1800 and the end of John Adams presidency. So during the Adams presidency, the Federalists rapidly lost popularity, rightfully so, to the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and also to the XYZ Affair. All those things combining kind of set John Adams up for failure in the election of 1800. But that's not what is most important here. What we're going to see is that people disliked not only the Alien and Sedition Acts and complained about the new taxes imposed by the Federalists to pay for the preparation costs for going to war. But even though John Adams avoided war, he had persuaded Congress that building up the U.S. Navy was necessary for the nation's defense. And what we're going to see is a hotly contested election along these kind of partisan lines, where the election of 1800 would actually sweep the Federalists from power in both the executive and legislative branches of the United States government, and a majority of the presidential electors casted their ballots for two Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Because both these candidates received the same number of electoral ballots, it was necessary, according to the rules in the original Constitution, to hold a special election in the House of Representatives to break the tie. In December 1800, the Federalists still controlled the House, which means they were able to preside over this special election. They debated and voted for days before they finally gave a majority to Jefferson. And Alexander Hamilton had urged his followers to vote for Jefferson, whom he considered less dangerous and of higher character than Burr. Ultimately, Democratic Republican lawmakers elected in 1800 took control of both the House and the Senate when the new Congress met in March of 1801. So the process to break this tie was that it would go to the House of Representatives, and ultimately they voted 35 times in a row without a clear-cut winner. So it's very, very hotly contested. People kind of set in their own ways, but Alexander Hamilton stepped in on the 36th ballot, cast that tie-breaking vote in favor of Jefferson. Jefferson wins. Burr is now the vice president, and you guys should know from our Hamilton notes of what will happen next in terms of how the relationship between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton would actually grow. So, the passing of power in 1801 from one political party to another was accomplished without violence, and this is incredibly important for us moving forward, is that this was a rare event for the times and a majority, and a major indication that the U.S. Constitution would actually endure these various strains, unlike its predecessor, that was the Articles of Confederation. So the Federalists quietly accepted their defeat in the election of 1800 and peacefully relinquished control of the federal government to Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans. And the change from Federalist to Democratic Republican control is known as the Revolution of 1800. And here it is, we see a ongoing, still to this day, tenure of a peaceful transition of power with each election cycle or every other election cycle that still continues today and is heralded as one of its most the Constitution's most championed kind of qualities. So Jefferson's presidency takes place. And I want to start by talking about this one quote from Jefferson that he's attributed with saying from his first inaugural address in 1801. He says, "Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection with which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called a different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." So in this first inaugural address, we see Jefferson seeing that this is a very divisive country at this point in time, and he's really trying to rally everyone together and really trying to understand how he can unite everybody, even though we have these staunchly differences in terms of our political ideologies and name our political parties. So, in the election of 1800, there had been a lot of animosity and bitter partisan feeling between the two national parties. Following this revolution of 1800, Thomas Jefferson, the new president, recognized the need for a smooth and peaceful transition of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. And that is why, with this inaugural address in 1801, he stressed the popular acceptance of the basic principles of the Constitution. By 1816, Jefferson's call for unity seems to have been realized when the Federalists had nearly disappeared, but the Democratic Republicans had adopted many of their positions. Under Jefferson and his close friend James Madison, the nation experienced a peaceful political change, expanded territorially, survived another war, and strengthened its democratic and nationalistic spirit. It was thriving, even as it faced significant problems, including slavery, the treatment of American Indians, and loyalty to its interests. So, before we talk about the Louisiana Territory, in Jefferson's first term, he attempted to win the allegiance and trust of the Federalist opponents by maintaining the national bank and debt repayment plan of Hamilton. In foreign policy, he carried out the neutrality policies of Washington and Adams. And at the same time, Jefferson retained the loyalty of the Democratic Republican supporters by adhering to his party's guidelines principle of limited central government. He reduced the size of the military, eliminated a number of federal jobs, repealed the excise taxes, including those on whiskey, and lowered the national debt. Only Republicans were named to his cabinet as he sought to avoid the internal divisions that were distracted by Washington. So in comparison to Adams' troubled administration, Jefferson's first 4 years in office were relatively free of discords. The single most important achievement of these years was the acquisition of by purchase of the vast western lands known as the Louisiana Territory. So the Louisiana Territory basically encompassed a large and largely unknown explored tract of western land throughout the Mississippi and Missouri rivers flowed. At the mouth of the Mississippi River lay the territory's most valuable property in terms of commerce, the port of New Orleans. For many years, Louisiana and New Orleans had been claimed by Spain, but in 1800, the French military and political leader Napoleon Bonaparte secretly forced Spain to give the Louisiana Territory back to its former owner, that was France. Napoleon hoped to restore the French Empire in the Americas, and by 1803, Napoleon had lost interest in this plan for two reasons. One, he needed to concentrate French resources on fighting England, and two, a rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture against French rule on the island of Saint Domingo had resulted in heavy French losses. So the U.S. Interest in the Mississippi River and this territory starts to grow. Negotiations take place between Jefferson and his ministers that were sent to France, and ultimately the Louisiana Territory would be sold for roughly $15 million and was quickly accepted by those ministers and Jefferson. However, there's a constitutional predicament here. It's that Jefferson and most Americans strongly approved of the Louisiana Purchase, but nevertheless, a constitutional problem troubled the president. And that was Jefferson was committed to a strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning we're reading the word that is written down and taking that for what that says, not what it might mean, and the Constitution, and rejected Hamilton's arguments that certain powers were implied. And there's no clause in the Constitution that explicitly stated that a president could purchase foreign land. So in this case, Jefferson determined to set aside his idealism for the country's good. He submitted the purchase agreement to the Senate, arguing that the lands could be added to the United States as an application of the president's power to make treaties. And casting aside the criticism of the Federalist senators, the Republican majority in the Senate quickly ratified the purchase. So, in terms of consequences from the Louisiana Territory purchase, it more than doubled the size of the United States and removed a European presence from the nation's borders and extended the western frontier to the lands beyond the Mississippi. Furthermore, the acquisitions of millions of acres of land strengthened Jefferson's hopes that his country's future would be based on an agrarian society of independent farmers rather than Hamilton's vision of an urban and industrialized society. Basically, in political terms, the Louisiana Purchase increased Jefferson's popularity and showed that the Federalists were a very weak sectionalist party that could do little more than complain about democratic Republican parties. So in comes the Supreme Court, and specifically a quick discussion on John Marshall. So after the sweeping Democratic-Republican victory in 1800, the only power remaining to the Federalists was their control of the federal courts. The Federalist appointments in the courts previously made by Washington and Adams were not subject to recall or removal except by impeachment. These Federalist judges therefore continued in office, much to the annoyance of Democratic-Republican President Jefferson. In comes John Marshall. Ironically, the Federalist judge who caused Jefferson the most grief was one of his own cousins from Virginia, that is John Marshall, that we see here. Marshall had been appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the final months of John Adams' presidency, and he held his post for 34 years, in which during this time he exerted a strong influence on the Supreme Court as Washington had exerted on the presidency. Marshall's decision, basically in many landmark cases, generally strengthened the central government and often at the expense of the states' rights. And one of the most important things that we need to take away from the Supreme Court and John Marshall during this early tenure of the U.S. Constitution is this case called Marbury versus Madison. And in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, it was the first major case decided upon John Marshall that put him in direct conflict with President Jefferson. Upon taking office, Jefferson wanted to block the Federalist judges appointed by his predecessor, John Adams. He ordered Secretary of State James Madison not to deliver the commissions to those Federalist judges that Adams was trying to appoint. And in one of these midnight appointments, so to speak, this gentleman named William Marbury sued for his commission that was promised to him but never delivered on behalf of President Jefferson. In the case of Marbury versus Madison, it went to the Supreme Court in 1803, and Marshall ruled that Marbury had a right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act passed by Congress in 1789. However, Marshall said the Judiciary Act of 1789 had given the court greater power than the Constitution allowed. Therefore, the law was unconstitutional, and Marbury would not receive his commission. In effect, Marshall sacrificed what would have been a small Federalist gain, that was the appointment of Marbury, for a much larger long-term judicial victory. By ruling a law of Congress to be unconstitutional, Marshall established the doctrine of what is called judicial review. And from this point on, the Supreme Court would exercise the power not given to them in the Constitution to decide whether an act of Congress or of the president was allowed by the Constitution. The Supreme Court could now overrule actions of the other two branches of the federal government, and we now see that the judiciary has gained and given themselves an additional check in terms of checks and balances on the other two main branches of government during this time period. So in the years following Washington's presidency, we see a lot of drastic change. We see a lot of kind of tribulations that the Constitution is going to kind of be weathered against. And we're going to see that the Constitution, unlike its predecessor, the Articles of Confederation, would turn out to be a much more firm document in terms of how it's not only surviving, but also allowing the country to expand and kind of contract at its own kind of time period, and it has flexibility. So largely what we see here with the establishment of the United States government is trials and tribulations, a learning process, and a desire for the country and its ideas to expand across the North American hemisphere. So with that, we're going to leave the establishment of the United States government and American politics throughout the region. And we will pick this back up starting with the War of 1812 when we get to nation building in the Americas.